Great. Welcome. Okay. Hello, I'm Mirko Draca, and I'm the director of the Cage Research Centre at Warwick University. Welcome to our virtual event, Making Sense of the Russia-Ukraine Conflict. We'll run this event firstly as a conversation between myself and Professor Mark Harrison, who I'll introduce more fully in a moment. We'll then open it up to questions. You should have a Slido link with your registration email where you can write questions that I'll sift through and give to Mark. So now let me introduce Mark and provide a preview of his insights. Mark is an emeritus professor at Warwick, and along with Nick Kraft, Steve Broadbury, and Steve Broadbury was one of the people who founded the Cage Research Centre in 2008. He joined Warwick in 1974 and has a deep expertise in economic history with a focus on Eastern Europe, especially Russia and the former Soviet Union. This expertise was gained in part by a period living in the USSR as a PhD student and being immersed in Soviet society and the Russian language. Mark's work has been widely recognized, for example, with 2 awards of the Alec Nove Prize, as given by the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies, named after the distinguished Glasgow-based scholar Alec Nove. Mark's work is deeply fascinating and innovative. A recent wave of work looks at the economics of secrecy in the Soviet Union and uses archival documents from the Lithuanian KGB. Another strand of works looks at the economics of the defense industry and general patterns of production in the Soviet and Russian economies, again using remarkable archival data. And then finally, with Steve Broadbury, Mark has recently been doing some high profile and popular work on the economics of World War II. This background underpins Mark's expertise in contemporary events related to the invasion of Ukraine, and he has maintained a blog focused on East European and especially Russian politics for some years now. His blog posts are very perceptive, and I want to give you a couple of quotes now, if I can just operate. So this is a quote from one of Mark's blog posts, Putin, King in Russia or Emperor of all Russians, okay, where he mentions, the Russian invasion was clearly well planned. It took the world by surprise and is occurring despite kind of limited or lukewarm popular support in Russia. This quote, again, sort of kind of reinforces these ideas of, there's clear blue water between the administration and public opinion, but the war goes on and the invasion plan goes on. The remarkable thing about these quotes talking about an explicit Russian invasion of Ukraine is that they actually date from March 2014, right? And this reflects Mark's writing about the earlier Ukraine crisis, where he was sort of anticipating events during that crisis. And later in September 2014, Mark wrote this post that I was reviewing the other day that really stuck out to me, where he says, "What keeps me awake at night is the thought that lukewarm NATO support for Ukrainian resistance might encourage Putin to try to change the facts on the ground quickly and irrevocably by means of a sudden all-out war." We have sort of distributed, so at the YouTube page and kind of with the registration email afterwards, we'll distribute some links to about 3 blog posts that I've identified that I read, which I thought were especially perceptive with regard to events 8 years ago versus events now. So let's just get to it. So welcome, Mark. We'll kick off with my first question, sort of a general big picture question I think a lot of people have been wondering about, which is, what does Putin want?
Thank you, Mirko. Very generous introduction. Russia is a regional power, and there's a general aspect of this, which is that Russia wants what every regional power wants, which is to feel comfortable in its own backyard. But after that, we have to go into specifics about what that means for Russia. And I think there are 2 things. One is that Russian foreign policy is increasingly dictated by a nationalist agenda that looks for a reunification of the Russian people. defined in a very 19th century way. There are the Great Russians, the Little Russians, and the White Russians. And together these make up what in Russia today is called the Russian world, the Ruski Mir. Mir is a word that connotes both the Russian world, but also the Russian community. And one of the problems of this Russian community is that much of it is extraterritorial. It's outside the territory of Russia. Some of it is much of it is in Belarus, in Ukraine. Some of it is in Moldova, Kazakhstan, and around the borders. And part of the issue here is that Putin regards the borders formed in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up as illegitimate, artificial and illegitimate. And Putin considers, therefore, that he has the right, if necessary, to remake those borders by force.
Okay. Yeah. So essentially, because we discussed this the other day, right? And so what I thought was fascinating is that kind of what we don't recognize is that there's this kind of concept of a greater Russia, right? And so there's this historic concept of the greater Russia, which is about Russia and what we would have thought of as kind of the outlying republics of the former Soviet Union, right? And so that goes back a long way. And then sort of as, you know, when Putin took over, he's gradually been building up that concept of a greater Russia. Is that the way to think of it?
Yes, I think so. And I think, you know, 8 years ago when Russia occupied Crimea, it was far from clear whether that would become the driving force of Russian policy, because you know, there was another simple explanation for the occupation of Crimea. One is that Crimea was a location of the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet, and it's a province full of Russians, and it seemed convenient to Putin to try and capture it, but also to bolster what appeared at the time to be a somewhat fading domestic base. And I think it did indeed have that effect. And so when I was writing 8 years ago, I was uncertain whether this would be the end of the process or just the start. But what we can see is that in fact it has been just the start.
Okay, and so how long has this sort of, you know, greater, like I think of it as like from what you told me the other day, it seems like Putin's been developing this kind of, as he's been in power, this greater Russia ideology, right? And so since he took over in 2000, he's kind of been building this up sequentially through different types of events, right? So through the conflict in Chechnya, through things like the Beslan siege, kind of through all of these events where he's been gradually building up this concept of a greater Russia, right? So is that the way to think of it, is that sort of this has been coming for a long time, that, you know, people like us in the West who are not close, or like me in the West who are not necessarily close Russia observers, we've missed kind of how he's been setting up these deep roots for a greater Russia ideology within kind of Russian society. Is that one way to think about it?
I tend to favour evolution over predestination.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Putin's biography, he began as a KGB officer in Dresden. He witnessed at first hand the breakup of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. And I think this had a traumatizing effect on him to some extent. You know, he was the guy in Dresden who was responsible for burning the files of the KGB to make sure they didn't fall into the hands of the angry crowd. And I don't think he's ever forgotten that. But at the time, I'm sure he was a loyal Communist Party member, and you know, he was thoroughly educated in the world outlook of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He's evolved from that. Not long after he becoming president, he referred to the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And people weren't sure what that meant. Did he regret the passing of communism, or did he regret the passing of the empire? As it's become clear, he's moved towards the latter interpretation. what he wants to restore is a world in which Russians feel free to move about and feel at home anywhere within fairly sweeping boundaries.
Okay, so Mark, but how deeply reflected is like the Putin view in Russian society, right? So, we tend to talk about kind of leaders such as Putin in terms of, we throw around the term fascist, right? And kind of fascistic overtones, or kind of a fascistic political model, right? How should we think about kind of the evolution of Putin's administration at the moment, right? In terms of the depth of popular support for a greater Russia ideology within Russia, and therefore kind of, the support for something like the Ukraine invasion. So how should we think of it in terms of a sliding scale from a extreme totalitarian state like the Nazi state towards sort of more limited types of autocratic states, towards, let's say, East European populist states such as Hungary or Poland?
Well, we reach these labels because it's comforting if we can say, oh, this is something we've seen already. I'm not completely convinced that fascist is the right word. Some of the nastiest regimes around the world have not been fascist, and calling it fascist, I think, is not particularly illuminating. He does draw on something. One way that I think of it is, what does anybody want? They want to feel proud of their country and their community. And there's no doubt that there's a proportion of Russian opinion that likes to look back to the past, to Russian greatness, to Russia having great power status, to Russia having control over its backyard. And he can mobilize that. But I also think that there's an element of this that comes from above and is working hard to try to direct popular opinion into this channel. It's clearly it's not altogether working. There's a new generation of cosmopolitan young people, I think, mainly young, mainly in the cities, but on the other hand, demonstrators everywhere tend to be young and urban. So it's hard to say to what extent their parents share those feelings or not. Russia is an authoritarian society today, and you're not going to get the truth out of anybody just by asking the question with a clipboard.
When we were talking the other day about this, it's sort of like a point you mentioned is in terms of like just how information flows in Russian society, right? And so your point would be that, the dominant information flow is television, right? And that's going to have an influence on how kind of the domestic reaction to the invasion. Do you want to expand on that point?
Sure. Until recently, Russia had quite a plurality of information sources, but many of them were being crowded out already. So if you were young, a bit tech savvy and so on, you could continue to get access to a range of media. Whereas, I think most people, ordinary people, tend to look to one source of news. They buy one newspaper, listen to one radio and television channel. And in Russia, before the invasion of Ukraine, that was chiefly state media. So I think most people have been getting their news from that, but there was always the possibility. If you really were curious, if you wanted to know more, you could turn to other information sources, some Russian, some foreign. Almost overnight, these have been more or less stamped out.
Okay, but your point would be that even before kind of Putin stamped out or put more controls on the media during the current crisis, that kind of the average Russian's information diet was pretty limited to state-run TV media, right? And they wouldn't necessarily be given much access to alternative information that's like critical or giving basic information about the invasion, right?
I think that's the case, yes.
Cool, okay. And then, so that's interesting. So in terms of the other dimension of kind of what you've discussed here, it seems like there's two factors at play. There's greater Russia ideology, and then there's this notion of like great power security, right? And so when I was a political science student back in Australia in the 1990s, we would learn these kind of theories of the great powers, and these kind of theories of international relations based on great power relations. And so and this has now come up again, right? And so you see kind of in terms of what Putin wants, it's this concept or this idea of great power security. Is that right?
Yes, I think he has a nostalgia for the days when the Soviet Union was surrounded by allies, and if they weren't allies, then at least they were neutral. And the idea of a sort of buffer zone between Russia and the West was very important to Soviet leaders, and I don't doubt that Putin would like to recreate it. I also think that he sees, he's seen opportunities in the divisions that have opened up in the Western Alliance recently. The semi-detachment of the Trump administration from NATO, Britain's exit from the European Union, disputes between Brussels and Warsaw, Brussels and Budapest. All these things have suggested to him, the West is disunited. There's an opportunity here to change the balance of power across the continent. And this has become increasingly attractive to him.
Great. Okay, so I think that kind of covers us on this issue of what Putin wants, right? Which I think is where we need to start with this in terms of for people like me who are not necessarily close what Russia watches, it sort of kind of gives us an idea of the roots of this crisis, okay? So in terms of the kind of next big question that comes into play when we think about responding to the invasion is, why wasn't Putin deterred by the threat of sanctions? That we had this period after the Crimea crisis and the kind of earlier conflict, and then this period immediately before the invasion earlier in this year where sanctions were threatened, but he didn't pull back. So why was that the case?
So I think there have been miscalculations on both sides. And I think Russia has, the Putin administration has clearly miscalculated a range of things. One being the ability of Ukrainian society to mobilize itself against an external enemy. We've all been, I think, terribly impressed by the resistance that Ukrainian civilians and soldiers have put up. And that was, I think, to him and to those around him, largely unexpected. They have this idea that Ukraine is really a kind of fake nation. It's not really a separate nation. And, that Ukrainian nationhood is a kind of artifact that would fall apart if given a little push. I think probably Putin also miscalculated the solidity of Western responses and the extent of the sanctions that have now been imposed on Russia. But I think there have also been mistakes on the Western side, and the one that has just preoccupied me a lot has been the extent to which Western leaders and public figures appear to have relied on sanctions to manage a threat of this nature. Mm-hmm. And I think from the side of the Kremlin, there's been a willingness to think that, whatever sanctions the West puts in place, okay, two things. The first thing is they haven't been that serious in the past. To the extent that they have been serious, if anything, Russians have reacted in a patriotic way to solidify around the regime in the face of an external threat. So we can count on that happening again. But also, even if sanctions were very, very far-reaching and serious, Russia has other options. And the most important thing that I think is often neglected, but perhaps if you think about it, you can actually see this at work in the present day. Sanctions are intrinsically a slow-moving weapon. You're trying to break down the adversary's will through the economy, through the civilian society, not directly through its military power. And so that has to take time, and in particular, it has to take more time than military action.
Okay, so yeah, Mark, I was struck like when I was reading your blog and going back to the posts from like 2014 and 2015, is that kind of you were anticipating kind of or you were kind of pointing out these weaknesses in sanctions during that period, right? So over that period, like when we were sanctioning Russia over kind of the earlier kind of incursion or invasion of the Ukraine, we continue to do plenty of economic business with them. I think the French were selling them amphibious assault ships or kind of weapons along those lines, right? So it seems like during that period, there was a mixed bag of sanctions that were at play.
Yeah, well, and probably much the most important aspect of that has been the continuing European reliance, and especially German reliance on Russian energy. Sponsorship of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Yeah. Okay. So to what extent do you think kind of Putin, because I was struck about this, like, my background is I'm Serbian, right? And so I watched the Yugoslav civil war, closely in the 90s and the early 2000s. And it always struck me that Milosevic was clearly exploiting kind of these kind of weaknesses in liberal internationalism in the West, right? In this kind of less than full-blooded commitment in the West to sort of different sorts of just stronger actions, or in particular, he was kind of exploiting domestic divisions in the US, within the West, right? So to what extent, was Putin undeterred because he knows, he's got this experience with playing like the liberal West, against itself, right? He's got this sense, he's got the measure of the liberal West and the weaknesses of the liberal West.
I think that's absolutely a factor. There's a sense in which modern democracies struggle to use military power. For a start, everybody has a humane resistance, the idea of inflicting violence on others. We also know of past occasions when military power has been misused, and opinions vary, but some uses of military power in the NATO bombing of Belgrade is one that arouses strong emotions among many. The Iraq War is another one. And in a relatively open society, it's easy for resistance to war making to emerge, and rightly so. I mean, I'm as keen on an open society as anybody, and people should have their say on the streets if they want. But to someone looking at this from someone in love with the authoritarian mystique, as Putin clearly is, sees this as just part of the general gridlock of democracy that makes democracies bad at making decisions, slow, unable to respond to events, and trapped by their own morality.
Right, and then sort of like when I was reading your blog, and it was sort of a bit of a shock to me, because when I was reading your blog and kind of going through what happened in 2014 and kind of thinking back to that time, to what extent, it seems like he was clearly testing the waters systematically across lots of different episodes, like so across Chechnya, the interventions in Syria, which we've kind of completely forgotten about, right? And so there were these, and just the nature of the annexation of Crimea, right? That's kind of, we never quite registered, or it didn't make it into the forefront of kind of Western political discussion, like, how radical that step was, right? And so do you see it as a kind of Russia watcher, the case that like he was just, this is like a pattern of behavior, and he was sort of testing the waters and executing a strategy over a long period of time?
Sure. I mean, as you talk through these events, I find myself thinking about the 1930s, which saw a very similar pattern of the dictators watching Western attitudes to the Italian occupation of Abyssinia, the Spanish Civil War, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and then German annexation of Austria, and so on. So these are all steps in which the dictators tested the water, and it took a long time for countries like Britain and France to sort of gear themselves up for a struggle. Arguably, even then, the French never quite made it. Of course, there's then a terrible question that arises from such sequences, which is, being realistic, could we have behaved any other way? Was there actually a way of preventing the Second World War?
Yeah, if we'd read your blog post, Mark, in more detail. But yeah, it's interesting in that, I sort of tend to react against these sort of references back to the 1930s and World War II, because we're constantly getting that, particularly in British politics, right? It's constantly going back to, it's sort of this, almost like an Arthurian, King Arthur type myth. It's assuming the qualities in the UK, right? But it does seem like once you go through what happened in particular over the last 10 years, you've got this pattern of great power emergence, and I hate to use the word appeasement, but kind of a lack of a robust reaction or a proper strategic reaction. But it does seem like there are those parallels. Okay, I've got one last area of questions. Okay, so we've sort of discussed sanctions, and we might discuss that a bit more as people kind of raise questions. But okay, so in terms of, Mark, you've watched this over a long period of time. You've studied Russia and the history of the Soviet Union. Your posts were really perceptive, as I've discussed. Okay, so the obvious question to ask, which I know academics don't like to answer these types of questions, is what does the West do now? What are the possible end games?
So, in the present situation, it seems to me that an outright victory for either side seems unlikely. You have two sides, both committed to a protracted struggle, and so this is going to go on for some time. And it's going to draw in more resources. It's going to inflame passions on both sides. I guess, the best outcome is probably going to be some sort of negotiation in which both sides will step back from their some of their deeply held commitments, which will be very painful.
Yeah. So one sort of argument that I've seen recently, right, is in terms of we've got this situation where the invasion has clearly not gone as initially planned by Putin and his generals, right? And both in terms of the military performance and in terms of the reaction with respect to sanctions, right? You and I as economists, we all learn a bit of game theory, right? When we analyze this situation, it's actually a pretty desperate situation in the sense that Putin has this strong incentive to go all in, right? Is that your sense of where we might be at the moment?
Yes, I imagine he's probably got his generals around the tables telling them if they don't wrap this up in a week or 10 days, they'll be court-martialed and or worse. I can't imagine that he's got any other kind of message for them at the moment. What they'll do when they receive that message, I have no idea. But I think Russia holds major military drills and war games every year. Mm-hmm. And one of the aspects of these drills is that they try everything. And it's established Russian military doctrine that if you want to resolve a conventional conflict quickly, you have the nuclear weapon. and nuclear weapons planning is integrated into all of their military drills. I mean, to put it another way, I think we often run the risk of putting things in different boxes. There's information war, conventional war, cyber war, so on, and we think of these as sort of alternative ways to approach a situation like this. And the Russians don't. They regard them as all part of the same set of weapons, and that each of these weapons could be weak on its own. I mean, even a nuclear weapon is weak if you have nothing else to go with it. And that's very much the situation of NATO at the moment. We have a nuclear deterrent, but what can we do? We're deterred from intervening in Ukraine by Russia's nuclear threats. So to be strong, you have to have all of these weapons and use them at the same time. And that is, I think, very much the way the Russians approach it. They may not practice it very well. I mean, I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. The implementation can be faulty.
Okay.
The concept that they have is to use everything at once, and that I think that's a risk in the present situation.
Okay. So I tend to be, when those sorts of the issues of kind of a nuclear dimension to the conflict come in, I tend to be a skeptic, right? I tend to write that off as a media. That gets you clicks, right? And in a more deep-rooted way, the reason I think that is because, there's a deterrence equilibrium, right? And, we established this with regard to kind of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War, that's those game theory concepts. And so do you see scenarios where that starts to break down in terms of the path of the current conflict?
Okay, so this is not about mutual assured destruction. It's not about just media clicks. I mean, it is a Russian military concept. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's a concept that they call, ironically, de-escalation. Mm-hmm. Because the idea is, how do you get the other side to de-escalate?
I see.
And it is by introducing nuclear weapons into it, perhaps one or two in a demonstrative way. Might be an airbase or an aircraft carrier, but you cause the enemy to step back and think again. So this is not just a media invention.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this
is
like,
but it would certainly be a very, very serious step to take, and all we see is the external theatre. We see that Putin has put his nuclear forces on a relatively low rung of alert. It's saber rattling. But we also know that every year they hold these drills, in which the final act is often the president gives the order for a nuclear strike.
Right. Okay. So you're saying, so they've got this concept, this de-escalation strategy. So that's essentially, okay, the two elements seem to be some saber rattling with respect to nuclear alerts. And then, so is there even part of this de-escalation strategy, like some sort of limited symbolic nuclear, like use of nuclear weapons?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's, yeah.
What one imagines that many voices would be raised against that.
Yeah. Okay. So that's my
problem. Is how many voices does Putin listen to?
Yeah.
We don't really know.
So that's my last question before I turn to the questions from the audience. Then is sort of one thing I've been trying to work out and do some reading about in the current context is the literal Kremlinology of the modern Kremlin, right? In terms of if we have this strategy where we're hitting the elites with sanctions, we're trying to influence the decision makers around Putin. What's the nature of, or the structure of political power within the Kremlin? Do you see it, what is the potential for a scenario where insiders in the Kremlin remove Putin?
It's hard to say, because the Kremlin has gone back behind a wall of secrecy. Mm-hmm. And that's been increasingly the case since Putin became president. In the 90s, everybody wrote their memoirs. That's not happening nowadays. we I think it's perfectly clear that most of the oligarchs would rather this war wasn't happening, but they're also not sources of advice. I mean, there may be many reasons to sanction them. I think that, you know, to see that as causing them to change their advice to Putin and then Putin cancelling the war, that is absolutely not going to happen. You know, if there's an analogy with the past, I think it's much more like Berlin in 1914, when the war party, you know, swept aside all the business interests and bankers and so on who were saying, what is all this about? You know, why do we need a war? Germany's getting stronger all the time, getting stronger economically, right? But the war party in Berlin simply saw Russia, simply saw Germany surrounded by enemies.
Right.
And the result was a war. You know, I think in Germany then, in Russia now, if Russia was a democracy, we would not be having this war, simply because it's a war from which almost all important social interests will lose in order for Putin to keep his job.
Got it. Okay. All right. So what I'll do now is I'll turn to questions. So people watching, you should have a link somewhere to a Slido where you can ask questions. Okay. So a couple of questions that we've gotten here that are of interest kind of relate to NATO, right? So this is kind of something that's emerging as a strand of discussion. So we've got one question from Andrew. I'm interested to hear Professor Harrison's take on Putin's deep-rooted view on NATO's expansion and why he's decided to pursue this operation. But there's a kind of another question on NATO. Okay. You know, the view from the other side, NATO has been expanding eastwards. NATO has sent weapons to Ukraine, even installed bioweapons labs, writes Anonymous. Okay, so why pick on Putin? Now, you've got this really interesting blog post at your blog about sort of analysing Jeremy Corbyn's position on NATO in 2015, right? And which is like a very smartly written blog post, which doesn't get into the usual culture war stuff you get when discussing Jeremy Corbyn. So, Mark, what's your view on like the blame that NATO expansionism can take for the current situation?
Okay, so there is a grain of truth in all this. You know, it's clear that you know, around 1989, 1990, some verbal assurances were given to Russian leaders that NATO would not expand beyond its existing boundaries. And now, nothing was ever written down, so there was no treaty or written agreement to that effect. And if one then stops and asks, well, why did NATO? So for those with short memories, what was followed by this was, first of all, that a number of the Eastern European countries that were formerly Warsaw Pact members joined NATO. And so that's places like Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And then subsequently, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, which were formerly part of the Soviet Union, also joined NATO. And what people tend to forget is what drove this process was not, you know, NATO or the NATO Secretariat. On the contrary, if you go back to this period, you see that NATO was very cautious and very anxious about allowing a process of expansion to go ahead. But the people of these countries were desperate to join. And they were desperate to join because they saw NATO as a source of security, among other things, against their Russian neighbor. And, you know, I can tell you that, you know, if you ask Putin or those people around him how they see this process, what they will tell you is, well, it's not really that the people wanted it, but there was ideological warfare by the West to make the people want it and make them demand it. So actually, Washington was behind it all along, right? But I have to say that's not how I read it. And, you know, and it seems to me that the desire of these people to have security against Russia was entirely understandable.
But did you think it's like the NATO argument, like the NATO, NATO expansionism on the Russian side and on Putin's side, is that just a proxy for like domestic regime insecurity, right? That like what Putin's really worried about, he was worried about the wave of protests from around 2010 to 2012 that took place, first with the Arab Spring, and then there were protests in Russia. It's sort of about domestic insecurity and the notion of these kind of countries in Eastern Europe and then close to Russia, such as Ukraine, just coming into that sort of Western sphere and undermining his own domestic security. So to what extent is this a bit of a smokescreen to like something which is just, an issue of regime stability?
I think that's essentially correct. I think the dilemma from the Kremlin's perspective is that that they can expand their borders, they can draw the border wherever they want, but on the other side of the border, there is always going to be the West now, and the West, it's the West of the rule of law and democracy and freedom of speech, freedom, and which they see as threatening to their own sources of power. So it makes sense to them to argue that the color revolutions in other countries along the border were fomented by NATO.
Okay.
But it's a conspiratorial view of the world that just says the West is out to get us.
Great. Okay. So I've got a couple of questions here that I'll combine. One from Natasha, in your view, what should NATO do now? And then another question from Steve, is establishing a no-fly zone a minimal necessary complement to sanctions?
So I'm a no-fly zone skeptic. For one thing, Ukrainian airspace is 10 times the size of any previous no-fly zone. So it's not even clear that it's really practicable. But it also concerns me that a no-fly zone would almost inevitably lead to direct conflict between, not just between NATO and Russian aircraft, but between NATO aircraft and Russian air defenses, including air defenses in Russia. Mm-hmm. To shoot down a NATO aircraft over Ukraine, you don't have to be in Ukraine.
Okay. So it's not a good idea from the view of like
people say, well, World War III has already started. All I can say is I hope not, because we would then be talking about millions of casualties and not thousands.
Got it.
But that's not to say that I think we should. I don't want to exaggerate my expertise. I'm not an armchair general, but it seems to me inevitable that we will not only need to give all kinds of assistance to Ukraine short of that, but also that we need to look to our own defences. We're not prepared for this kind of war. We thought this kind of war would not happen again, and Britain and other European countries have underinvested in our defence in recent years, and we probably need to spend more on it now.
Okay, and there's a question here from Andrew. So it's they talk about a video related to their original question, which was about kind of why Putin's decided to pursue the operation. So Putin made a speech on the 24th of February this year. You said you know about that speech. So what was that speech, and what's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm assuming this was a speech in which he essentially set out the rationale for recognising Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as independent states, and launching the so-called special military operation. And it was a long speech in which he essentially set out his view that Ukraine is not a proper country or a proper nation, but it was created by Lenin and Stalin. Lenin brought about the breakup of the Russian Empire. Ukraine became very briefly independent. It was then absorbed back into the Soviet Union, but Stalin put in place a policy of recognition of ethnic minorities, including Ukrainians. And so in Putin's view, this kind of put a time bomb under the structure of the Russian Empire.
Okay, so that speech was essentially like him setting out his like the full version of his greater Russia ideology, essentially, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And so that was like his big, grand statement on this, probably where he's made versions of this statement before.
Well, and it also helps to explain, if he believes it, it helps to explain why he thought that the invasion of Ukraine would be a walkover.
Yeah. Because
Ukraine is just this artificial construct that will blow away when given a sharp tap on the shoulder. And
okay, so that's interesting. So that's kind of tying to this issue of how Putin perceives kind of public opinion and what's happening to public opinion. So we've got a question here from Rodrigo, which relates to this, which is the halting of operations in Russia by many Western companies more likely to fuel resentment against Putin, or against the West amongst Russian people? So with your knowledge of kind of Russian society and how it works and how you've studied it, what do you think will be the initial public response to the impact of sanctions? Like, how is that going to affect opinion?
So I think a couple of days ago, Putin made a comment which struck me as perfectly apposite, which is he referred to Western sanctions as akin to a declaration of war. Right? And again, we in the West think of sanctions as an alternative to war, but Putin understands that they are actually a part of war, right? And I think ordinary people who are the targets of sanctions or who are the collateral damage of sanctions understand in the same light. So I think it's probably inevitable in the short term, there's a rally around the flag effect. Mm-hmm. How long that persists depends on a lot of things that will take time to work out. So if the perception spreads that the invasion of Ukraine hasn't gone well, that their president has let them down, that the president miscalculated or did something wrong, or that if word gets back from the soldiers in Ukraine that atrocities have been committed, that civilians have been targeted, I'm sure that this can help to unravel that perception.
Okay.
But yeah.
All right, we've got time for a couple more questions. So we've got this interesting little question again by an anonymous person. Okay, so it relates to this idea of it's an interesting thread. Why does Putin regard the Ukraine as neo-Nazis, right? So there's this element of his rhetoric and Greater Russia rhetoric where he invokes the Nazis and neo-Nazis. So is that, and we see that, looking at that, we see it as a bit of an eccentricity, but is there some thread he's pulling on there that makes that resonate with a kind of bigger segment of the general population in Russia than we anticipate?
Okay, so Ukraine has a far right, as does most countries that I can think of. I'm not sure if they're any more numerous. They're electorally very unsuccessful. So measured by the criterion of votes cast, they're not really a significant force, but they're there. Okay, but the Russian propaganda has a tendency to depict anybody who resists them as Nazis. Right? So. And this does have a chord with the public because you know, if you think of, you know, every country has its founding story. And for the Soviet Union, the founding story was always the October Revolution of 1917. But we've moved beyond communism now. And since then, what has largely taken its place is World War II, when the Russians lost 26 or 27 million dead because of German invasion and occupation of part of the country. And, you know, this is especially salient because if you look at Russian history in the 20th century, this is about the only thing that really went right. And so for Russians who want to feel proud of their country, World War II and the commemoration of World War II has become enormously important. And you know, what's the story? Well, it's communists versus Nazis. So it does strike a chord.
Okay.
To say that they're out to denazify Ukraine.
Okay, so I guess it's like we know in the UK what a strong hold kind of World War II has in terms of domestic political thought.
Yeah.
So that's as an Australia, I come here and see this, and it's like we've got that World War II thing as well, but it does seem to be this kind of very strong thing that looms in the British psyche, and in terms of its kind of national perception. Okay, we got a couple of questions here. Okay, so it's about explicitly what can NATO and the West do now? So Kirill asks specifically what action by the West, in quotation marks, could make Putin de-escalate and withdraw from Ukraine in your view?
I don't have an answer. I'm pessimistic.
Okay.
It's very hard to see a good end game to this. And, you know, to go back to the very beginning, we're looking at a failure. Not only a Russian failure, I mean, that's probably transpiring, but also a Western failure. The Western failure to be ready to, Western failure to deter. We've underestimated the adversary, and I don't know where to find a good outcome from this.
Okay, so one notion I've seen discussed is like if you look at this like in a very basic game theoretic framework, it's like he's made a miscalculation. He's in deep trouble. When you're in that situation, the incentive is to go all in and to escalate, right? Which seems to be what he's been doing with some shelling and sort of more aggressive military action. And one response you can have in this situation, which we're sort of seeing with the talks, is you give someone like that the golden bridge out, right? So a key thing he needs to do is save face, right? And so what do you think, and that would probably involve the Ukraine making some sort of concessions, at least symbolic concessions, and sort of just getting the Russian troops out of there. Okay, so what do you think of the likelihood of that sort of scenario, that Putin would take a golden bridge, and like how wise would that course of action be for like the Ukraine and for people interested in sort of just general long-term regional stability?
It seems to me that that's probably the nearest to a good outcome that we can find. I can see pain for both sides. And I would like to think that Russia should bear some of the pain for this, having created the situation in the first place. But I don't know. I mean, I think for Putin, his survival is at stake. And it's going to be very hard for him to go away with a lot less than he set out to obtain.
Exactly. So even if he were to survive and like take some sort of golden bridge. Okay, so if he were to survive and take some sort of golden bridge, right? So if they sat down in a couple of weeks I don't know where they're doing the talks at the moment, in Turkey, they're doing the talks in Turkey. and that he comes out with some sort of symbolic thing where Ukraine agrees never to join NATO, right? But then, you know, Ukraine just has lots of like logistical and financial military support from places like the United States, France, and Great Britain, right? And so at least some sort of symbolic and probably some territorial concessions. He's still like, would the greater Russia ideology and those ambitions be dead, right? Or would he come back? Would he come back in 10 years?
Oh, I think it's too important to him to think that he wouldn't come back.
Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, exactly. So
yeah, I think, and for that very reason, I think probably this this horrible struggle has to go on for a while.
Okay, great. All right, so we're nearly out of time.
Yeah.
Go on, Mark.
No, I'm. You're really pushing me at the limits of my expertise. That's why.
Okay. All right. That's fine. All right. Okay. Is there anything else that you wanted to kind of point out or cover in terms of any last words of like the one insight that you would have seen or that you haven't seen that you want people to know about?
I think it's a heartbreaking situation. I've worked on Russia all my life. I've visited it many times, and I could not be more distressed at what's happened. But that's there's no more analytical insight in that.
Okay.
Just a feeling that I want to express. You know, I love Russia. I have many friends in Russia, and I'm so sad that this has come about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we got a lot of questions coming in, but we're just about out of time. I'd like to thank you for being part of this event, Mark. I think you've shed light on a lot of really important issues, such as kind of this greater Russia ideology, the way different incentives play out in terms of Putin's strategy, the history of how this has developed over the years. I urge everyone watching, we should have a follow-up email, which is going to have links to some of Mark's blog posts over the years, which you can read and see as directly and eerily prescient. So I've identified in that email 3 major blog posts on Mark's blog that I see as particularly relevant in terms of shedding light on kind of the current Russia-Ukraine crisis or the invasion. And I'd also like to flag, if you search for a blog post related to kind of Mark's comments on Jeremy Corbyn's policies with regard to NATO circa 2015, which is kind of a really well-written, calm sort of post about those policies that's kind of free of sort of culture war type discussions. So I recommend you kind of all read that. It's some of the best writing I've seen about kind of the Russia and Ukraine situation. Thank you for joining us, and please keep an eye out for other events that Cage is might be running on this topic and other topics in the future.